Hey y'all, Dr. Scott here. I want to talk about a few things. They're big topics, they deserve more attention. I'm going to do an overview of shame, narcissism, and spirituality. Okay? This could be a part of the spiritual bypassing series, another commentary on it. And I think it's a really, really, really rich topic. It's one that's very close to me, very dear to me. I've spent a lot of time working with this, my background, my training as a therapist, my research as a scholar, all in this realm, in this topic. So, let's start with shame. I want to share a story that comes from one of Brene Brown's books, which itself is a tongue twister, but the story goes in her book, I thought it was just me, but it isn't. She's describing taking a plane flight. And on the plane flight, there's a sort of a woman that seems very outgoing, talking to her and asking her about Brene Brown and asking her about what Brene Brown does. And she says she's a researcher. Brene Brown does. I'm a researcher. And the woman asks her, well, what are you researching? And in essence, she says, women and shame. And the woman on the plane doesn't hear it at first. And then she asks again, and Brene Brown clarifies, women and shame. And apparently this very chatty woman all of a sudden becomes very quiet and says she needs to go to sleep or she needs to rest. Now, we can't know what this person exactly was experiencing. However, I think it's reasonable to wonder, well, what happened there? If we can assume that this person didn't want to talk about shame, what is it about shame that she, or maybe we, don't want to be talking about? So, really important question here. Shame is something that tries to limit our exposure. It's an affectual, meaning like an emotional reality experience that serves a role to try to protect us from being overexposed. Exposed to what? Well, exposed to harm. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that every time we feel shame, we have a threat for physical harm, but really the association here is that shame tries to moderate. I call shame a moderating emotion. Shame tries to moderate our exposure to potential threats. So the challenge, though, is that often shame as a function, as a protective process, outlives its usefulness in our lives. That we internalize it when we're young, typically because we've been shamed somewhere in our families, in our societies, in our culture, at least in this society, which we'll get to in a moment. That's how it happens. We learn to compare ourselves to other people at a very young age. And so we start to take in this shame. Now, there are multiple layers to shame. Again, it could sort of a much larger video. In essence, shame is a protector that then assumes more power than the rest of us wants it to. Now, I would say shame exists on a spectrum for us in terms of how much it influences our emotional lives and our behaviors. So some people, maybe it's very developed, some people maybe less developed. However, it is extraordinarily present. And while we might think of it as being, in some ways, not unique, but might think of it as sort of a truly American experience, which I will get to. Shame is also a key factor in many other cultures. Shame is a way that we enculturate people, meaning it's a way that cultures and societies tell us how we should be, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. It's a way that our belief systems assert what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. Shame is the enactment of those limitations, of those beliefs at times. It's the vehicle through which those beliefs are sort of imposed on our reality and each other, on which we impose them on each other, on our children. Anytime we hear the word should, it's always a link that perhaps there's shame operating. Now, I'm not saying 100% of the time that's the case. I'm just saying it's always worthy of questioning. What's underneath this? Am I comparing myself? Is this coming from a place of feeling inadequacy? Inadequacy and shame interrelated. In fact, often inadequacy is what motivates us, and shame can be a tremendous motivator for accomplishment, achievement. And while on one hand that we might see that as a positive thing, achievement, especially in this society, achievement that comes from inadequacy ends in inadequacy. Meaning, when we achieve whatever we achieve, we don't get away from the inadequacy. It still manifests because we haven't really understood the message underneath it, underneath our desire to achieve, which is that we want to actually feel acceptable unconditionally. And in that sense, shame is a gateway to a kind of unconditional acceptance, if we can understand it as such, bring attention to it. So if we go back to Brene Brown's story, though, right? Shame often exists in silence. That's sort of the premise of a lot of her work. And it's true. Shame makes us want to hide, and we don't talk about it publicly. That's shameful. It's sort of its own feedback loop there. And at the same time, what's clear, what we know, is that if we can't learn to identify shame, which can include talking about it, I'm not saying we talk about it to sort of just anyone, but that if we can't learn to identify how it operates inside of us, if we can't learn to identify and eventually talk about it, that what's going to happen is it's going to assert an energetic presence in our mental flow and functioning. And if that remains unconscious, then what we do often will be a reaction to the shame, the sense of inadequacy. So that it will in a way inform our actions without our knowledge of it. And then we won't really be addressing the true issue, at least that layer of the true issue, quote unquote, which is that there's inadequacy motivating it, or shame, that our behavior might be connected to that. So if shame exists and we keep pushing it out of our awareness, that's when we get other issues. So many of the people that I work with, so many of all of us, we think we have an anxiety disorder or depression. When we look at what key components are in that, if we see anxiety as sort of a system of emotions and thoughts, and depression also as sort of a system of emotions and thoughts. And I know there are other perspectives. I'm not saying that those are inherently wrong, but just if we take this kind of subjective lens and look at it as a system inside of ourselves, often what keeps that system in place is shame, what we call low self-esteem, shame, or the sense that something must be wrong with me, shame. When shame's unconscious, it definitely can contribute to anxiety, depression. If it's leaking into our consciousness, meaning we're aware that we have low self-esteem, still, in order to make progress with that, we need to be able to make space for the shame and name it. In naming the shame, we take some of the power out of it. In keeping it unnamed, it continues to assert its energy in our mental functioning, our emotional and bodily functioning as well, our behaviors. Which isn't to say that we should be more ashamed if that happens. That would be counterproductive, right? I'm not suggesting that, we're bad because it does that. It's just, in my experience, it's just a reality. So let's start to pivot a little bit towards spirituality. And I know I said narcissism, so I want to sort of include that word as well and that idea, because shame is very much connected to what we might understand as narcissism. Okay, so let's start with the narcissism. So much of what I see on social media includes people talking about other people's narcissism. And you'll notice that this is always kind of a pet peeve of mine. Now, that being said, I'm not suggesting that we should tolerate abusive behavior or that that's okay or minimizing that. I'm not interested in that, no. We need to be able to recognize abusive behavior, absolutely, and to protect ourselves from it. So that's my caveat. Now, why is it a pet peeve for me? Because I think it when we talk about other people's narcissism, one, it reduces, it's a narrow conception of narcissism, so that would be, I could talk about that in another video, a longer one. But in the context of this video, it's a pet peeve because it assumes that narcissism is outside of us. It otherizes narcissism. And I don't believe that that's the most useful thing for us if we truly are interested in our own self-development or spiritual development as well, and spiritual development. Now, sometimes it's really important for someone in their development to be able to name someone else's patterns as narcissism. Again, I'm not trying to reduce that. Just trying to say that ultimately, it's in my experience, very important that we can recognize these patterns within us as well. So, in essence, if I have to boil down, what is narcissism? What we call narcissism? A very sort of broad view of it. Narcissism is a way we protect ourselves from vulnerability. It's a specific set of protective processes from vulnerability, from the sense of inadequacy. Now, often people think about narcissism on a certain end of the spectrum, like your most severe cases of narcissism that people, they're so self-involved and, they can't do any wrong. Well, actually what that comes from, if we think of it as a protective process, is the inability to tolerate vulnerability and the inability to tolerate the sense that we could be inadequate. So it's a protection against that. And even if we don't maybe experience ourselves as on that end of the spectrum, in some ways we've all had to develop protections against vulnerability, starting from a young age. And what starts to develop then is this kind of layered cake of protections. And often shame, when it comes to narcissism, is a fundamental part of that, because in narcissism, we trying to protect ourselves from inadequacy, from the experience of that. Inadequacy is threatening. Let me just explain this. Inadequacy is threatening to us because if we feel that we could be rejected, it connects directly to the survival aspect of our brain. As human beings, we are somewhat unique in the animal kingdom in that we depend on our caretakers for an extraordinarily long time relative to many other species. So the idea that we could be rejected would literally be life-threatening to us, especially, let's say, for our ancestors. If we were in the wild and we had to fend for ourselves as children, that meant death. Okay? So this part of us adapted, and the shame adapted from that. It adapted as a way to try to make sure that we could conform to the expectations of our family so that we could be acceptable on some level. And even as adults, if we were in the wild, we still depended on our tribe, on the people around us. Because if, for our ancestors, if they were solo, the risk for them would be very great. The chances of survival would diminish. So the fear of rejection and the attempting to protect ourselves against the sense of inadequacy which would lead us to rejection is, in some ways, a very strong evolutionary function. And I think it's important that we understand it as such, lest we try to somehow shame our shame, which actually doesn't work. It's counterproductive. So we need to understand it as this, the way that some aspect of our bodies learned to protect ourselves. And what we call narcissism is a way that shame then sort of structures our personality, structures our protective processes, other protective processes, where in order to defend against a sense of inadequacy, we need to either inflate ourselves or protect ourselves against deflation. So this can look like, oh, I need to have the best of the best therapists. I don't settle for anything less than that. Or this could look like, a constant comparison of ourselves and trying to find out how we come out on top. These are protective mechanisms. The inverse of that is that when we compare ourselves and come out on bottom, which structurally is a similar process, that we experience low self-esteem. It's just the inverse. And even if we compare ourselves and we come out on top, that potential boost to our self-esteem is ephemeral. Because what happens is underlying that, there's an unconscious sense of inadequacy motivating. So even if we come out on top, it's not really actually satisfying. It doesn't provide us what we need, except for maybe momentarily. So while I could spend more time on narcissism, I want to talk about the spiritual process, okay? And it's relevant in comparison. If you've seen my other videos, you know there's an emphasis on the comparative mind. First, however, I want to talk about sort of a famous interaction in Buddhist communities between Sharon Salzberg and the Dalai Lama. So it was, I think there's different accounts of it. If you read Sharon Salzberg, at least I just looked at it, she said in 1990, someone else said maybe late 80s, 89, something like that. Maybe it was during New Year's, so maybe it was both. I couldn't tell you. In essence, what happened was that Sharon Salzberg, who's a kind of a famous Buddhist teacher now, insight meditation teacher, loving kindness teacher, she asked the Dalai Lama about self-hatred. And the Dalai Lama didn't know what it was. And he had his translator trying to translate, it sounds like for about 10 minutes or so. And it didn't like land for him, process for him. It didn't make sense. Like there wasn't a reference point. And, much can be made about how we interpret that. And if we look at, there's a video from, I want to cite this because I want to give credit here, by Doug's Dharma on YouTube, where he talks about, how we might interpret this. And he brings in this idea that self-esteem is sort of a uniquely American problem. He cites a researcher, I believe philosopher, Francisco Varela, who asserts that self-esteem is that he doesn't see the same issues in other cultures besides the U.S. Now, I would argue that while there might be truth to that, some layers of truth, I can't tell you definitively, that actually when we're talking about self-hatred, let me just make this link for you. When we're talking about self-hatred, what we're talking about is shame. I don't believe self-hatred could exist without a sense of shame or inadequacy. This is what we're talking about. So self-hatred, we might think that that's anger directed at the self, and it might be. However, the distinction I'm making is that shame must be involved in that to some degree. So back to this conversation, is shame uniquely, in this kind of self-esteem, uniquely an American issue? Well, I do not think so, because shame has been utilized culturally. Shame is, again, it's a way that certain cultural norms can be established. And then what happens is shame gets internalized into our bodies and minds, meaning we take it in and it becomes a part of our identity and also a part of our physical, affective reality. So I don't believe that shame is only an American issue. Perhaps within the context in which this conversation is happening, it might be uniquely American in that particular presentation of it, which is relevant to name that. Nevertheless, here the Dalai Lama says, I don't really have a concept for this. So, regardless, whatever we glean from this, right? Whatever we glean from this, it's an interesting anecdote that reveals that many of us on the spiritual path will be confronted with the sense of inadequacy. And perhaps if certain traditions don't have the language or the perspective to work with that, we may do ourselves a disservice by not addressing that inside of us, if it exists, which I can tell you, in my belief, in this society, I believe that this exists in all of us to a degree, and because it's part of the structure of our psychology. It's part of the structure of our survival systems. And that just doesn't, that's not like doesn't just not show up for a lot of people unless you have a particular sort of rare occurrence, I suppose. I'm not saying it's impossible, just saying to me it would be very rare. Meaning that to some degree, this process is inside all of us. And so, in a spiritual context, so many of us, myself included, we come to the spirituality because we want to get out of pain. We're in pain. Something about our existential reality is challenging. We want to experience freedom or enlightenment or connection with God or whatever you want to call that. And so the challenge is often the pain is informed by our sense of inadequacy, that the inadequacy itself can often bring us into our spiritual practice, and our spiritual practice can be a sort of quest to get rid of the inadequacy. Understandably, spiritual traditions often use language of perfection. They use that language, which interfaces well with the idea, with perfectionism within us, with the shoulds, with the shame, because perfectionism is always fueled by shame. At least the kind I'm talking about. And so if we take that language and we say, oh, I've got to be perfectly enlightened, it's very likely that we will then internalize the spiritual language through, or see it through the lens of our shame system. And that can become its own source of, here's the bypassing related to narcissism, our own source of trying to protect ourselves from vulnerability. That now, spiritually speaking, we're trying to protect ourselves from vulnerability. And of course we are. There's no judgment in that. This would be considered kind of bypassing, though. We name this. It's important to name this because it can become an obstacle to us in our development. If we don't name this process, we're likely to be practicing in reaction to it, behaving in reaction to it. I mean, how could we otherwise? What else would we do? Now, some people may not identify with that. Okay, that's all right. However, I think it's still useful to examine how shame and inadequacy may inform part of our pursuits in this realm. One of my dear teachers, I heard him say this. I don't remember exactly when it was. He said to, I think it was a group at that time, that our vulnerability is our invincibility. And I just couldn't get that. I couldn't get it. And, to this day, part of me still is, no, I'm not sure I can get that. And yet, as I talk about this and continue to explore this topic, the alternative, it's clear in some ways that the alternative can never lead to a state of open consciousness. The alternative can never lead to the state of what we might consider the state of invincibility, which isn't physical invincibility, but it's a state of consciousness that's imperturbable, that's unable to be manipulated, changed, altered, broken. Because if we're trying to be invulnerable, we have to split ourselves. We have to compare. We have to suppress. If we're actively in those processes, we are not actively identified with openness, awareness itself, which doesn't have the energy, can't suppress, can't exclude, can't make division, really can't compare, is not comparable to anything. So, in that way, our vulnerability is a bridge, is the medium through which we connect with spaciousness, through our tenderness. Tenderness is what leads to openness. So, a quick recap. What I'm suggesting is that we do our best to include shame in our process of development. Not as something that we should try to get rid of, but as something that we can embrace. And by embrace here, I don't mean perpetuate by telling ourselves we're terrible. I mean embrace as a protective part of us and love. To express gratitude to the part of us that's trying to protect us, and allow that to take us into an acceptance, which then brings us to openness. Openness, consciousness itself, awareness itself, it doesn't have the power to reject anything. It's non-exclusive. Can't be. Cannot exclude anything. So we can practice that on the conditional level, and generate a bridge. Through our practice of acceptance to the state of consciousness that can only accept, cannot do anything but accept unconditionally. That's not divisive. So may you be well. Thank you for watching.